He was a boy who never quite fit the rhythm of the world around him. While other children chased each other across the schoolyard, laughing and shouting as the sun threw golden shadows across the pavement, Rick sat alone on the steps of his porch, fiddling with scraps of wire and half-broken toys. He wasn't unhappy, not exactly, just quietly apart, as though his mind played to a different song than the rest. Sometimes he would take apart a radio just to see if it had a heart, some secret pulse that explained the music flowing through it. He never found one, but the act of searching seemed to soothe him. The world, to young Rick, was full of locked doors, and every screw he loosened, every spring he tugged free, felt like trying a new key. His mother, watching from the window, would smile faintly at the sight of him, her son so serious, so intent, as if the mystery of existence itself rested inside the shell of an old toaster. He never told her about the dreams, though. The dreams where ordinary objects leaned close, whispering things that didn't make sense in words, but lingered like the echo of a song he almost recognized. A lamp, telling him that light was just time slowed down. A crumpled paper bag, murmuring that infinity was just circles drawn too wide to see. There was one dream in particular he never forgot. A simple sandwich, bread, cheese, lettuce, nothing special, sitting on a plate in the sun. But in the dream, it turned to him and said softly, "You'll never finish me, because I'll always begin again." He woke with crumbs on his pillow, though he hadn't eaten in his sleep. That strangeness nestled into him, quiet as a lullaby. Rick grew to love silence more than sound. He would sit in the backyard long after the other kids had gone inside, staring up at the sky that seemed too large, too endless for a boy his size. Sometimes it comforted him, that stretch of stars. Other times it felt like a question he couldn't yet answer. Why so big? Why so far? Why him, small and searching? He didn't yet know what he would become. He didn't yet know the weight of his own mind, or the sorrow that often accompanies brilliance. All he knew was that the world felt unfinished, as if someone had left him the task of putting the pieces back together. And in that quiet way, the boy began to turn into the man who would one day stand against the void. But for now, he was only a child in the dusk, fireflies flickering around him like scattered sparks, his small fingers tracing blueprints on scraps of paper no one would ever see. And though he never said it out loud, there was comfort in the thought that the universe was watching him too, whispering back in its own mysterious way. And perhaps that was enough. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the sky seemed to sigh rather than storm, and Rick sat at the kitchen table with a plate in front of him. Just a sandwich, nothing unusual. 2 slices of bread, a smear of mustard, and the faint crunch of lettuce tucked in between. But as the rain tapped the windows like 1,000 tiny fingers, he found himself staring at it the way someone might gaze into a fire, as though it were alive, flickering, holding secrets. He didn't remember taking the first bite. Perhaps he hadn't. The sandwich seemed whole, untouched. But suddenly there it was. A voice, not loud, not startling, but quiet, as if it belonged to the rain itself. "You'll never finish me," it said, "because I'll always begin again." Rick blinked. His mother hummed somewhere in the other room, pots clattering faintly on the stove. Nothing in the kitchen had moved. The sandwich sat as it had always sat, waiting. And yet something lingered in the air. A strange certainty, like déjà vu with teeth. He leaned close, whispering back as though to a secret friend. "What do you mean?" No answer came. Not in words, at least. Instead, the boy felt a thought, not his own, drift across his mind like a feather. That everything, even the simplest thing, was part of something wider. A bite of bread was not just bread, but a memory of wheat, of soil, of rain clouds that once wandered above some distant field. The sandwich was a loop, and so was he. Rick's small hands hovered above it, not quite daring to touch. He wanted to laugh at himself, but he couldn't. Instead, he felt an odd calm, a hush that spread from his chest outward, as though the universe had leaned down to reassure him of something he couldn't yet put into words. That night, he dreamed again. The sandwich appeared, glowing faintly under a sky of drifting stars. It didn't move, didn't speak this time. It only rested there, patient, waiting, as though to remind him that answers were not always meant to be solved in one sitting. Sometimes they had to be tasted slowly over years, over lifetimes. In the morning, his mother found him asleep at the table, his head pillowed on his arms. The sandwich was gone. She assumed he had eaten it, though crumbs dotted only one side of the plate. When she woke him, Rick said nothing. He didn't try to explain. How could he? And yet, the memory of that strange, whispering meal became something he carried like a charm in his pocket. Whenever he felt out of place, whenever the stars looked too far away, he remembered the voice of the sandwich, calm, infinite, unhurried, and he felt, just faintly, less alone. It would not be the last time something ordinary turned extraordinary in his world, but it was the first. And firsts, no matter how small, tend to stay. The first time Rick truly noticed the sky was not in the day, but in the quiet hush of an evening that stretched far beyond bedtime. The house had grown still, his mother's humming had faded into silence, and the windows glowed faintly with the dim gold of tired lamps. Rick slipped out the back door, his shoes crunching softly in the grass, and lay down flat on the damp ground, as, though the earth itself might cradle him. Above him, the sky was impossibly wide. The stars looked scattered at first, like careless sparks, but the longer he watched, the more they seemed to form a rhythm. A pattern he almost, but not quite, understood. He whispered numbers under his breath, not knowing why, as though counting might unlock the hidden order of the night. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. The weight of that endless dark pressed gently upon him, not heavy, not frightening, more like the sensation of being noticed, as if the sky was aware of him in return. He thought of the sandwich, its whisper about beginnings and endings. Looking up at the stars, he realized they too were unfinished things, burning, fading, only to be born again in ways his young mind couldn't yet name. He felt smaller than he had ever felt, and yet strangely safe inside that smallness, like a single note in a song far larger than himself. The wind shifted. Fireflies rose around him, blinking in slow intervals as if trying to imitate the constellations above. He reached out his hand, and one rested on his finger for a moment, its tiny body glowing against the backdrop of infinity. For the first time, Rick smiled, not the sharp grin of mischief, but a soft, unguarded smile. He wondered if the stars could hear him, if perhaps by lying there long enough, he could listen to their language the way he had listened to the sandwich. Maybe they too carried secrets, patient and endless, waiting for someone willing to stay quiet long enough to notice. Sleepiness pulled at his eyes, but he resisted it, wanting to hold on to that moment of strange connection. He promised himself he would never stop searching, never stop asking. Because the sky, wide and endless, felt less like an answer and more like an invitation. Later, when his mother found him curled in the grass, his hair damp with dew, she carried him inside without a word. Rick stirred only faintly, half dreaming, whispering something she couldn't quite make out. She thought it was nonsense, a child's half-asleep rambling, but it was a question. "Why so big?" he murmured into her shoulder. "Why so far?" And though no answer came, the boy drifted into dreams with the stars still watching, steady and eternal. The backyard grass, the fireflies, the infinite sky, they became part of him. A memory that would never leave, no matter how many worlds he wandered through. At school, Rick rarely spoke. He carried his notebooks tucked under his arm, pages filled with crooked diagrams that no teacher understood. While the others learned to recite multiplication tables, Rick had already begun sketching strange loops of numbers, formulas that seemed to whisper to him of patterns hidden behind the curtain of the ordinary world. The teachers shook their heads. Some called him gifted, others called him distracted. Most simply didn't know what to do with him. He answered questions they had not asked, raised problems no one else had noticed, and stared out the window as though something outside was teaching him more than the lessons inside ever could. During recess, when the playground filled with shouts and laughter, Rick wandered along the fence line, dragging a stick through the dirt, as though he were writing a language only the earth could read. Sometimes he would pause to watch the others, curious but not envious. He didn't resent them, their games of tag or their secret jokes whispered in huddles. He just didn't feel the pull to join. It wasn't loneliness in the way adults feared. He wasn't aching for company, only for understanding. To be seen not as the boy with strange eyes and stranger questions, but as someone who was trying, in his own quiet way, to piece together the world. And yet, there were moments when it hurt. Birthdays he wasn't invited to. Groups that closed their circle when he approached. He told himself it didn't matter, that the stars outside were better companions than children who only knew how to laugh at things they couldn't understand. But in the quiet of night, lying awake in his small bed, he sometimes wished just one of them would sit beside him, not to play, not to ask, but simply to stay. His mother tried. She would set a glass of milk by his desk, her presence soft and steady as he scribbled late into the evening. She didn't always understand the sketches, but she understood her son, that his mind was restless, tender, searching. She loved him for it, though she worried too. One day a teacher asked him, gently, why he didn't join the others. Rick shrugged and said, "They're fine. They just live closer to the ground than I do." It wasn't pride, not really. Just a truth he couldn't unlearn. His head was tilted upward, always, toward a sky that felt like both a question and a promise. The years ahead would widen that gap. His brilliance would carry him further from the ordinary, and the world would sometimes mistake distance for arrogance. But in these early days, he was simply a boy who carried questions larger than his small body could hold, waiting for someone, anyone, who might hear them without turning away. And so he grew quietly, half in the classroom, half in his own universe, half with the children, half apart, never fully belonging, but never fully lost. A boy suspended in the space between. It happened one afternoon, in the half-hour between the bell ringing and the world settling down again. The playground had emptied into a blur of bicycles and voices calling homeward. Rick lingered behind, as always, dragging his shoes through the dust, his notebook clutched close to his chest. He didn't notice the boy sitting on the swings until the chains creaked softly in the wind. His name was Elliot. He wasn't the fastest runner, nor the loudest voice. In fact, like Rick, he seemed to carry a kind of quiet around him, the way some children carry freckles or dimples. He was staring at the clouds, his feet barely brushing the ground, as though the sky held more interest than anything else. Rick almost walked past him, but then Elliot spoke, his voice low, almost shy. You ever think the clouds look like maps to somewhere else? Rick froze. He had never heard another child ask a question like that. He turned slowly, searching Elliot's face for mockery, but found only a small, serious smile. Against his better instincts, Rick nodded. Sometimes, he said. That was enough. From then on, they found each other in the quiet corners, the edge of the fence line, under the shade of the oak tree, or lingering after class while the others rushed off. Elliot didn't always understand Rick's diagrams or his restless explanations of infinity, but he listened. That, to Rick, felt like a miracle. One afternoon, Elliot brought him a marble from his pocket, a swirl of green and blue that caught the sunlight in strange, shifting ways. He pressed it into Rick's hand. It looks like a whole planet, Elliot whispered. Maybe one only you could find. Rick kept that marble for years, long after childhood blurred into the smoke of memory. It rattled in the corners of his desk drawers, rolled across workbenches cluttered with wires and glass, a small reminder that once someone had seen him not as strange, but as worth staying beside. They never called each other best friends. Children don't always name such things, but their silences fit together, and sometimes that was enough. One evening, after a long day of being misunderstood, Rick lay in the grass with Elliot at his side. The fireflies blinked, the stars began their slow shimmer. Rick whispered, half afraid, "Do you think we'll still know each other when we're old?" Elliot turned his head, thought for a moment, and said softly, "Even if I forget everything else, I think I'll remember you." It was a simple promise, given in the unpolished honesty of childhood. And though life would scatter them like leaves caught in different winds, Rick never forgot those words. In moments of great distance, in universes where everything felt broken, he would sometimes feel that voice again. A boy on a swing, asking if clouds were maps, reminding him that even loneliness can be shared if only once. Rick's room was never tidy. Wires tangled across the floor like vines, and old radios leaned against half-empty cereal boxes. To anyone else, it looked like a mess, but to him, it was a map. A puzzle slowly coming together piece by crooked piece. He had begun to build things that didn't quite belong to childhood. Not toys, not exactly machines, but something in between. A lamp that flickered only when he sang to it. A small box with no switch that hummed whenever the rain touched the roof. A compass that didn't point north but spun in slow circles as if it were always lost and strangely content about it. No one asked what they were for. Perhaps because no one knew he was making them at all. His mother only peeked into his room now and then, careful not to disturb the scattered parts. She saw the concentration on his face, the furrow of his brow, and thought, "He is building something important, even if I don't know what it is." At night, Rick dreamed of machines that could answer the questions he couldn't speak aloud. In those dreams, the contraptions would breathe softly, as though alive. One would unfold like an accordion and release clouds shaped like faces he almost recognized. Another would tick like a clock, but never move forward, holding him in a warm, suspended moment where nothing could be lost. Sometimes he woke with tears on his face, though he didn't know why. One evening, Elliot sat cross-legged on the floor, watching as Rick soldered wires together. "What's it supposed to do?" he asked. Rick didn't look up. "I don't know yet. Maybe it's not supposed to do anything." Elliot tilted his head. "Then why build it?" Rick paused, the soldering iron cooling in his hand. He couldn't find the right words. How could he explain that building felt like breathing? That when he made something, he wasn't alone. The world seemed to lean closer, whispering through metal and sparks, telling him he was a part of it. So instead, he just shrugged. "Because I have to." Elliot nodded, accepting the answer without needing to understand it. That was his gift. He never pushed, never mocked. He simply stayed, his quiet presence filling the spaces where Rick's own silence would have felt too heavy. As the weeks passed, Rick's little machines filled shelves and corners. Some broke the moment he touched them, some hummed for days, only to go silent without explanation. But each one carried a piece of his heart, a fragment of longing, a flicker of wonder, a question without an answer. And though no one else ever knew, Rick began to see them as companions of a sort. Not friends like Elliot, not family like his mother, but echoes of himself, reminders that even loneliness could take shape, could be molded into something that hummed back when the nights grew too quiet. He didn't yet know that these small, odd creations were the first steps on a path that would stretch across galaxies. He only knew that in the hush of his room, beneath the faint glow of a desk lamp, he was no longer just a boy. He was a maker. And makers, no matter how young, always dream a little further than the world allows. Some nights, when the machines were quiet and the stars were hidden behind thick clouds, the house would fill with his mother's voice. She sang softly, not a song from the radio, not something anyone else seemed to know, just a tune she carried from somewhere deep in her memory. It rose and fell like the tide, simple and unhurried, as if she were humming to the walls as much as to her child. Rick would pause whatever he was building. His hands would hover above wires or glass, and he would sit very still, letting the sound drift through him. The song seemed to fold the air into something warmer, safer. He didn't always understand the words. Sometimes there were none, but he understood the feeling. It was the sound of being kept, of being held, even when no arms were around him. One evening, restless after another long day at school, he asked her, "Why do you sing that one?" She smiled, her hands busy with dishes in the sink. "Because my mother used to sing it to me, and hers before her. Songs are like stories you don't have to explain." Rick thought about that long into the night. A song as a story as something that could travel across time, across generations, without ever needing to be written down. The idea sat in his chest like a spark. He began to hum it himself quietly, when no one else was listening. While tightening screws, while staring out at the backyard sky, even when Elliot was beside him, the tune sometimes slipped from his lips. Elliot never asked about it. He only listened, nodding along as if the sound belonged there. The melody crept into his dreams too. In one, he wandered a field of machines that hummed in the same rhythm as the song, their wires glowing softly with each note. In another, he found himself sitting at the edge of the universe, and the stars themselves pulsed gently in time with the tune, as though the cosmos had always known it. He realized, without meaning to, that the song carried him through moments when words failed, when the loneliness pressed too close, or when the questions grew heavier than his young shoulders could bear. He would hum, and the echo seemed to answer back. Years later, when memories blurred and people drifted in and out of his life, the lullaby would remain. Even in the deepest silence, even in the loneliest dimensions, he would sometimes hear it faintly, as though the universe itself was humming just for him. But for now, he was still a boy in a small house, listening to his mother's voice rise gently above the clink of dishes, feeling the strange, comforting truth that some sounds never leave us. They only change shape, echoing forward, waiting to be remembered. The nights grew longer as Rick grew older. It wasn't that the clock slowed or that the stars lingered differently in the sky. It was that his mind began to stretch beyond the walls of his small room. He would lie awake, staring at the faint glow of his mother's night lamp bleeding through the hallway, and his thoughts would race into places he couldn't follow. Why were they here, in this quiet corner of the world? Why did time feel like water slipping between his fingers? And why, no matter how much he built or repaired, did he still feel something missing, like a shape he could almost see, but never touch? Sometimes he whispered these questions into the darkness, as if the air itself might answer. One night, he asked aloud, "What happens to us when we're gone?" The silence that followed was immense, stretching over him like a second blanket. He could hear the ticking of the old clock, the sigh of the wind through the trees, the faint shifting of Elliot as the dog dreamed. But no answer came. And yet, sometimes in that silence, he felt closer to something vast, a presence not unkind, not frightening, but impossible to name. It was as if the world was listening, even if it didn't reply. The next day at school, his teacher spoke of stars being born and dying across endless distances. Rick felt a shiver move down his arms. He wondered if his mother's lullaby had been older than stars, or if the stars themselves had been humming it long before anyone could hear. Elliot noticed his distraction. On the walk home, the dog nudged his hand, grounding him back into the earth. Rick laughed softly, scratching behind his ears. "You're right. Too many questions for one head." But the questions didn't stop. He began to carry a notebook, its pages slowly filling with sketches of impossible machines. Towers that touched the clouds, windows that opened into other skies, clocks that didn't just measure time but rewound it. He didn't know if such things could ever exist, but drawing them gave him relief, as though mapping dreams into paper was a way of keeping them safe. Late one night, his mother found him still awake, bent over the notebook. "Rick," she whispered, brushing his hair gently. "You'll burn yourself out, chasing shadows." He looked up at her, his eyes heavy with stubborn light. "But what if the shadows are real?" She kissed his forehead and said nothing more. But as she left the room, he thought he heard her humming again. That same old tune, wrapping the silence with something warmer than answers. Rick closed his eyes, clutching the notebook to his chest. He dreamed of a horizon beyond the horizon, and somewhere far away, he thought he saw figures waiting. Not unfriendly, not unknown, just waiting. And when he woke, the questions were still there, stronger than ever, like a tide that refused to turn back. It was the kind of afternoon when the clouds hung low, pressing soft shadows across the schoolyard. Rick walked slowly, hands deep in the pockets of his jacket, his notebook tucked under one arm. He wasn't thinking of games or grades or anything the other children worried about. He was thinking about the machines waiting for him at home, the wires and springs that might answer questions he couldn't ask aloud. Elliot found him under the old oak tree, as usual, sitting cross-legged with a marble spinning slowly between his fingers. "You're quiet today," Elliot said softly. "I'm thinking," Rick replied. Not that Elliot needed an explanation. He never did. The two sat together in silence, letting the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds fill the space between them. Rick realized he had never noticed how comforting the presence of another could be. It wasn't excitement, not the kind that makes you laugh until your stomach hurts. It was something steadier, warmer, a gentle assurance that someone understood, even if they didn't understand everything. "Do you ever feel like the world is too big?" Rick asked after a while, watching a leaf spiral lazily to the ground. Elliot nodded. All the time, but then I remember that some of it is just waiting to be found. Rick blinked. That simple thought settled into him like a stone sinking into a quiet pond. Waiting to be found. Maybe that was why he built things, why he sketched, why he stared at stars until the night became too heavy. Some things, some pieces of the universe, were just waiting for someone patient enough to notice. The bell rang faintly in the distance, calling the children back to classrooms, but Rick and Elliot didn't move. They sat, watching the clouds shift, comfortable in the hush between moments. Rick felt a rare kind of peace, one that didn't need to be explained or named. Later, when they walked home, Rick carried his notebook more loosely, and Elliot spoke quietly about a story he'd heard, about a river that ran backward or a tree that grew in circles instead of straight. Rick listened, intrigued, and sometimes he even added his own twists, imagining machines that could map such impossible wonders. At home, his mother noticed him more serene than usual. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She knew some friendships were invisible, made of whispers and small understandings rather than loud laughter. That night, as he lay in bed, the echo of her lullaby returned softly. And beneath it, faint but certain, was the memory of Elliot sitting beside him under the oak tree, the comfort of a companion who stayed even when words failed. Rick closed his eyes, holding that quiet warmth like a lantern. It wasn't much, and yet it was enough. Sometimes he thought the universe might be big and strange and impossible to comprehend, but even the smallest bonds, a marble spinning, a shared silence, a friend who simply sits nearby, could carve out a space where the world felt soft and kind, if only for a moment. And in that space, Rick let himself rest, letting the questions and the machines wait just a little longer. Some nights, Rick would lie in the backyard long after the house had fallen silent. The wind would stir faintly through the trees, carrying with it the soft smells of damp earth and the faint residue of summer blossoms. Above him, the sky spread wide and black, dotted with stars blinking like distant lanterns in an endless hall. He began to notice patterns, subtle movements in the night sky. Stars appeared to wink at different rhythms, clusters shifting over hours, and sometimes, fleetingly, he thought he could see them drift closer, as though curious about him in return. It was then he realized that stars were not eternal. Some flickered and died, vanishing without warning, leaving only darkness in their place. Others burned brightly for long stretches, then dimmed, fading to whispers in the sky. Rick thought of the lullaby his mother hummed, the echo of Elliot's quiet presence, and he felt the strange kinship between himself and the stars. Bright, fleeting, searching. The night taught him humility in its own way. He could build machines, tinker with wires, sketch impossibilities across the pages of his notebook, but he could not make a star last forever. He could not stop time or keep things exactly as they were. The stars would live and die in their own rhythm, indifferent to his curiosity, yet somehow patient enough to shine for him anyway. Rick's mind began to wander. Perhaps he thought life was a little like a star, a small burst of energy, a presence that mattered in its moment, then fading. And yet, even after the light disappeared, its memory lingered, etched in the dark like faint music that refused to end. Elliot, noticing his contemplative silence during one afternoon stroll, asked, "Do you ever get scared of being gone?" Rick hesitated. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I think the stars aren't afraid, they just shine as long as they can." That answer, simple and incomplete, seemed to satisfy both of them. Elliot nodded, and they continued walking in quiet harmony, letting the world whisper around them. Back in his room, Rick scribbled star maps in the margins of his notebooks. He imagined machines that could capture light, little inventions that might record the faint music of a dying sun. He knew he would never truly hold a star, but tracing its movements gave him a sense of connection. Small, fragile, but real. Night after night, he returned to the backyard, letting the sky speak to him in its slow, patient language. Sometimes he hummed his mother's lullaby in tandem, a small thread tying earth to stars, boy to universe. The fireflies danced quietly at his feet, and for a moment all seemed aligned, the humming, the lights, the cool air brushing against his skin. And Rick began to understand slowly that the universe was both cruel and gentle. It could take away, yes, but it could also teach patience, wonder, and a quiet reverence for the fleeting moments of brilliance in all things. When sleep finally came, it carried him gently. Not with answers, not with certainty, but with the soft acknowledgement that even the smallest observer could witness greatness, and in witnessing belong to something far larger than himself. Rick had begun to notice small patterns in everything, not just in stars or machines or marbles spinning lazily in sunlight, but in the tiny exchanges that seemed to pass unnoticed. A leaf falling, perfectly timed, next to a flower. A neighbor's smile that lingered longer than politeness demanded. Elliot laughing quietly at a joke no one else would understand. It was in these moments that Rick began to understand something unspoken, that even small actions mattered, that kindness, thoughtfulness, curiosity. These were not trivial, they were ripples, and perhaps in some quiet way they could become a force larger than anyone imagined. One afternoon he found a bird tangled in the fence. Its wings fluttered with panic, but Rick moved slowly, speaking softly, reassuring it without expecting gratitude. Hands trembling slightly, he untangled the wire and released the bird into the sky. He watched it rise, a flicker of gold and white against the blue, and something inside him shifted. That was enough. That small, careful act was enough. Elliot, who had been watching from a distance, said simply, "You have a good heart." Rick had never thought of it like that. He had thought of machines and marbles, of stars and questions, but not of himself as a source of good in the world. And yet, in that quiet afternoon, he felt a flicker, the faint recognition that perhaps he could leave small traces of light wherever he went. The nights that followed, he hummed his mother's song with new understanding. The machines he built, the sketches he drew, the thoughts he wrote in margins of his notebook, all were extensions of himself, tools for noticing, remembering, and perhaps guiding. Even Elliot began to notice. "You're making things that help people, even if they don't know it yet," he said one evening, kicking a pebble down the street. Rick smiled quietly, feeling the weight and the comfort of that first recognition. There would be grander acts in the future, acts that might shake worlds. But for now he learned that significance was not always loud or visible. It could hide in patience, in care, in the act of noticing. That night, lying beneath the quiet sky, he imagined stars winking at him in silent approval. Perhaps the universe itself noticed small acts of light too. Perhaps it hummed them back in secret, just as his mother's song had always carried him. Rick began to understand that these quiet movements, these unseen acts, this careful, noticing heart, would one day matter more than he could imagine. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the first spark of purpose. He closed his eyes, clutching his notebook against his chest, and drifted to sleep. The wind whispered through the trees, the fireflies blinked their steady rhythm, and the universe waited, patient, as always, for him to learn what he could become. There was a window in Rick's room that always seemed just slightly too high to reach. Not impossibly high, but high enough to make him pause when he looked at it from his desk. On rainy afternoons, when the glass fogged with the breath of the world outside, he would press his small hands to it and watch the drops trail downward in winding rivers, carrying reflections of clouds and trees in their fragile, shifting shapes. One evening, after Elliot had left and the house was silent, Rick discovered something strange. He had been tracing the water patterns with his finger when a reflection in the glass seemed different. Not his own, not quite real. It was as though the window had turned into a portal, showing him something beyond his small backyard. Not a different place exactly, but a place that felt layered, like the world had folds he had never noticed before. He leaned closer. The reflection didn't move as he did. It flickered softly, then shimmered like a dream caught between sleep and wakefulness. For the first time, Rick felt the weight of possibility pressing gently against him. Perhaps there were more ways to see the world than just through eyes. Perhaps the universe had corners meant only for noticing, not for conquering. That night, he scribbled feverishly in his notebook, drawing windows of all kinds, some round, some square, some impossibly long, imagining what might lie beyond each one. Some would show stars bending into new constellations, others rivers that ran through the sky. He imagined worlds just out of reach, always there, waiting for him to look carefully enough to see. Elliot sometimes came by to watch him, sitting quietly on the floor, watching Rick's pen move in loops and spirals. "Are you building a machine?" he asked one evening. Rick shook his head. "I don't know yet. I think I'm building ways to notice things." Elliot didn't ask more. He understood that some creations weren't meant to move or make noise. They existed to teach patience, attention, and quiet awe. Days passed, and Rick began to carry this lesson outside. He noticed the way shadows moved differently on walls depending on the time of day. He observed the birds' patterns, the way sunlight flickered through leaves, the silent drift of clouds across the sky. Every small observation became a thread in a larger tapestry, one that only he seemed able to see in its entirety. And always the window lingered in his mind, a reminder that some boundaries were just waiting to be looked past, that some mysteries could be held in silence and still be understood. That night, before sleep claimed him, he returned to the window one last time. The rain had stopped. The sky above was dark, dotted with faint stars that blinked slowly, patiently. Rick pressed his hand lightly against the glass, imagining the worlds it could show him tomorrow, the quiet lessons he had yet to learn. He lay down in bed afterward, notebook resting against his chest, and let the calm of the house seep into him. The wind whispered through the trees, the distant hum of the universe carried faintly in his dreams, and Rick felt, for the first time in a long while, the soft certainty that noticing, truly noticing, could be a kind of magic all on its own. Rick had begun to notice that the line between dreams and waking was thinner than most people realized. Some nights he would lie in bed and feel the hum of his machines faintly, vibrating beneath the floorboards, and he could swear that the shadows on the walls were whispering softly in response. One evening, after a long day spent sketching improbable inventions in his notebook, he closed his eyes and felt the pull of a different kind of thinking, one that didn't follow rules, didn't measure time, didn't count steps forward or backward. He imagined walking through a hallway where each door opened to a sky he had never seen, where each staircase led him to clouds shaped like memories, and where light itself seemed to fold around him like silk. In his dreams, Elliot sometimes appeared, though not always, as the boy he knew. Once he was a bird with feathers streaked in gold and green, swooping around Rick as he navigated floating rooms of stars. Another time, Elliot was a shadow that stretched across the sky, pointing silently to the constellations that blinked at them in approval. Rick began to realize that these dreams weren't merely fleeting images. They were a kind of rehearsal, an exploration of possibilities he couldn't yet name. They allowed him to wander beyond the smallness of his body, beyond the limits of his room, and into a space where curiosity became courage, and imagination became something tangible. In the mornings he would wake with the remnants of these dreams lingering like dust in the sunlight. He traced them into his notebooks, drawing towers that spiraled endlessly, bridges that arched across the night, and machines that seemed more alive than any object in his room. Sometimes he smiled at the memory of a dream and whispered, "Maybe one day you'll exist." Elliot noticed the change. "You look like you've been somewhere far away," he said one afternoon, while they sat beneath the oak tree. "I have," Rick admitted, "and I think I might be learning something." "What's that?" "That some things exist to be noticed," Rick said, "even if no one else sees them." Elliot nodded. He didn't need more explanation. He understood that discovery wasn't always about proof, or applause, or recognition. Sometimes it was enough to feel the wonder, to carry it quietly in your chest, and to let it guide you. That night, as Rick lay in bed, the house hushed around him. He hummed his mother's lullaby softly, letting the notes echo alongside the shadows of his dreams. Somewhere, beyond the walls of his room, beyond the reach of his small hands, the world waited. Waiting for the boy who noticed, the boy who dreamed, the boy who had begun to understand that even silence could speak volumes. And in that quiet space, he drifted further, allowing himself to fold into his dreams completely, the boundary between real and imagined dissolving into a calm, endless sky. Rick had started noticing how small the world could feel when you stayed in the same place for too long. Even the backyard, familiar though it was, seemed to shrink under his gaze, offering fewer surprises with each passing day. The streets, the oak tree, the swings at the playground, all of it remained unchanged, as if waiting for him to grow, to see something different. He began venturing farther. Short walks at first, just beyond the familiar fences. The air smelled different there, damp and rich with soil, carrying scents he had never known existed. Grass bent differently under his shoes. Shadows stretched longer, deeper. Every small difference made his heart beat a little faster, not with fear, but with anticipation. Elliot followed as always their quiet companionship, a tether to the comfort of what was known. "It's strange, isn't it?" Elliot said one afternoon, pointing at a hill whose top shimmered gold in the late sun. "How just walking a little can make everything look new." Rick nodded, feeling that strange thrill of discovery, the kind that didn't demand applause or notice. "It's like the world has little secrets," he said, "and maybe it's waiting for us to find them." The hill became their quiet haven. They would sit there for hours, letting the wind shift around them, watching clouds stretch and fold, listening to the distant hum of life in the streets below. Rick often took out his notebook and sketched what he saw, not to capture reality exactly, but to understand it in the way he could. Each line, each curve, each improbable angle was a whisper of the universe's vastness, folded gently into his own understanding. Sometimes he thought of his mother's lullaby, humming it softly under his breath. Sometimes he remembered the small acts of kindness he had done, the bird released, the marble shared with Elliot, and realized that he was beginning to carve a space of his own in the world, quiet but undeniable. One evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the sky bled pink and violet, Rick felt the first flicker of courage, not the loud kind, not the kind that demands recognition, but the quiet, resolute type that whispers, "I will step forward, even if I cannot see the end." He imagined his machines waiting at home, wires and gears poised to answer questions he hadn't yet asked. He imagined the stars blinking at him across the distance, patient, eternal, as if encouraging him to notice everything the world had to offer. And somewhere in the distance, Elliot's presence reminded him that companionship was a quiet power in itself, that even when venturing into the unknown, he was not entirely alone. Rick breathed in the cooling evening air, feeling the world stretch before him. It was strange, it was beautiful, it was vast. And he felt, for the first time, the gentle thrill of realizing he could step beyond the known, carry his curiosity with him, and find solace in both the journey and the quiet spaces he left behind. When he returned home that night, he hummed the lullaby with a new understanding, as if the tune had expanded to fill not just his room, but the horizon itself. And when sleep claimed him, it carried him gently, letting him drift with the soft certainty that the small steps of today could become the quiet foundations of tomorrow. The mornings had begun to feel different. Even before the sun rose, Rick would awaken to the soft grey light spilling through his window, the gentle hum of the house settling into its day. He had started noticing the way small things shifted, a shadow stretching longer, a bird lingering a moment too long on a branch, the faint creak of floorboards he had never heard before. He realized that the world, in all its quiet complexity, was always moving, always teaching, always offering something if he chose to see it. It was patient. It didn't rush. And yet, somehow, it was always pulling him forward. Rick spent hours with his machines, now more refined and deliberate. The small contraptions that once hummed quietly in corners were becoming something more. They responded to sound, light, and motion in ways subtle and graceful. They were not meant to impress anyone, not meant to show power, but to mirror curiosity, to turn observation into understanding, to turn patience into wonder. Elliot often sat beside him, sketching imaginary maps of rivers and stars, sharing silence instead of conversation. Rick had learned by now that words were not always necessary. Presence, attentiveness, quiet companionship. These were gifts far more powerful than any declaration. One afternoon, Rick paused in his work and looked toward the horizon where the sun hung low, painting the world in soft amber. He felt a strange pull, not fear, not urgency, but a gentle insistence that there were places yet to be explored, questions yet to be asked, connections yet to be made. The universe was wide, mysterious, and patient. And he, small as he was, had a place within it. That evening, as night folded over the sky, Rick returned to the backyard. The stars blinked faintly, distant yet familiar. He hummed his mother's lullaby, soft and warm, letting it ripple across the quiet air. Somewhere in the distance, Elliot's figure was just a shadow against the darkened trees, but it was enough. A reminder that companionship and curiosity could coexist, quietly shaping a life without spectacle or noise. Rick felt the gentle weight of possibility in his chest. He did not know what tomorrow would hold. He did not know where his small experiments, his sketches, his observations would lead. But he understood, now more than ever, that the act of noticing, of caring, of being present was already a kind of magic. And as he lay in bed that night, notebook tucked close, machines humming faintly in the corners of the room, he let sleep carry him slowly into dreams where clouds shaped themselves like stairways. Rivers ran backward into stars, and possibilities stretched farther than he could imagine. And somewhere, he knew, The universe was watching, patient, ever patient, and waiting. For the boy who noticed, the boy who imagined, the boy who had begun to understand that even small acts of light could illuminate infinite spaces. Rick had begun to feel that the world was larger than the walls around him, larger than the familiar fences and streets. Even the backyard, once comforting in its routine, now hinted at hidden corners, secret rhythms and mysteries that waited quietly for him to notice. He would sit for long stretches beneath the oak tree, sketchbook balanced on his knees, tracing patterns in the clouds or the way sunlight filtered through the leaves. Sometimes Elliot would lie beside him, ears twitching, breathing slow and even, as if he, too, sensed the quiet pulse of the universe. Rick had started listening to whispers. Not voices, not words exactly, but faint currents of sound like wind threading through chimes, like a faint hum beneath the floorboards. He could feel them vibrate softly through his fingertips when he touched the metal parts of his machines. Sometimes the hum would align with the rhythm of his mother's lullaby, and he would pause, pen hovering above paper, just to let the moment exist. He realized that noticing was becoming more than a habit. It was becoming a lens, a way of understanding small ripples of light, shifts in shadow, the subtle cadence of life around him. Every bird in the sky, every flicker of a firefly, every leaf trembling in the wind felt like a signal, a soft conversation with a world that rarely spoke in human terms. One evening, Elliot asked, "Do you ever wonder what's outside all this? Beyond the fences, beyond the hills?" Rick nodded, eyes tracing the horizon. "All the time," he said. "And I think it's okay if we don't know everything yet. Some things just wait for us to find them, quietly." That night, as Rick lay in bed, he thought of the small acts of attention that had begun to fill his days, releasing a trapped bird, listening clouds, noting the patterns in his machines. They were like soft steps towards something larger, though he did not yet know what. Each act, though small, felt like a thread weaving him into the vastness of life itself. He drifted into dreams that night more vividly than ever before. In the dream, he wandered along a river that sparkled with tiny lights, each one pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Trees leaned toward him as he passed, leaves brushing against his cheeks like whispers. Somewhere above, stars moved in gentle arcs, blinking slowly as if inviting him to follow. Elliot appeared in the dream as he often did, a quiet companion in a world that was simultaneously strange and familiar. Rick realized he was learning something fundamental, that exploration was not just about movement or machines or sketches, but about presence, noticing, listening, feeling, and allowing the world to reveal itself in its own rhythm. By morning, the faint light of dawn spilled across his notebook. Sketches and notes littered the pages, not neat, not orderly, but alive with his discoveries. Rick smiled quietly, understanding that curiosity could be both gentle and infinite. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the first trace of what would later become his purpose. The gentle, persistent pull of questions yet to be asked, and possibilities waiting patiently in the quiet corners of existence. And as sleep left him fully, he carried that calm certainty into the day, knowing that some whispers were meant to be followed, some mysteries to be cherished, and that the universe, in all its vastness, was patient enough to wait with him. Rick had begun to notice how small moments held unexpected weight. A single shadow sliding across the sidewalk, a breeze bending the branches just so, the faint hum of machines in corners. All of it seemed to carry a gentle message, if only he took the time to listen. He wandered farther than before, beyond familiar streets, letting the world pull him gently forward. Elliot padded beside him, tail low, eyes alert, and Rick realized that the small rhythms of companionship could anchor even the quietest adventures. He began to see that curiosity was not simply about discovery, it was about presence, awareness, and the patient act of noticing what others might overlook. One evening, he paused on a hill, the horizon spilling pink and amber across the sky. The clouds seemed to fold inward, forming shapes he couldn't name, patterns that moved just out of reach. He traced the lines with his eyes, imagining machines that could mirror them, sketches that could capture their fleeting shape. And for the first time, he felt the pull of something larger than himself, a subtle invitation to step closer, to understand more fully, without fear. "Do you think the world is listening?" Elliot asked softly, sitting at his side. Rick thought for a moment, watching a leaf spiral slowly downward. "Maybe it is," he said. "Or maybe it doesn't matter if it's listening. Maybe what matters is that we're paying attention." That night, he returned to his room with a quiet sense of purpose. The notebook lay open, waiting. He sketched the shapes of clouds, the movement of fireflies, the subtle rhythms of the stars, letting his pen move freely, tracing patterns that existed more in imagination than reality. In those drawings, he discovered a strange, calming truth, that the act of noticing, of drawing, of listening, was itself a bridge between himself and the vastness of the universe. Elliot curled beside him, as he often did, and Rick hummed his mother's lullaby. The sound filled the room, wrapping around the hum of his machines and the soft scratch of pencil on paper. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, between observing and imagining, Rick began to understand that curiosity was not about answers, but about connection, a way of touching the edges of the world without needing to own it. He drifted into sleep with the gentle certainty that his small acts, sketches, observations, quiet companionship, humming the familiar lullaby, were all threads in a larger tapestry he did not yet fully see. The universe, vast and patient, stretched endlessly above him, and he felt, for the first time, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. And as the night deepened, he let the quiet hum of the world carry him further, trusting that curiosity itself could be both a companion and a guide. Rick had begun to realize that some lessons could not be rushed. Not understanding a machine, not observing a pattern, not listening to the whispers of wind and light, all required patience. And with patience came clarity, subtle and slow, like the gentle unfurling of dawn. He spent afternoons watching the sky, noticing how clouds moved in tandem with the wind, how shadows stretched across the streets and hills, and how the smallest things, a bird alighting on a fence, a leaf gliding to the ground, carried stories if he only chose to notice. Elliot lay nearby, tail flicking softly, a quiet rhythm that grounded Rick in the present, even as his mind drifted toward the infinite. Sometimes he wondered if the world itself was waiting for someone to see its patterns, its hidden movements, its quiet dances of light and shadow. He began to understand that observation was a kind of dialogue, not a demand, that noticing without judgment, without urgency, could become a bridge to understanding far more than words ever could convey. One evening, Rick traced the movement of a cloud that seemed impossibly long, stretching across the horizon. He imagined machines that could follow its path, sketches that could map its shape, and he understood, more clearly than ever, that the act of waiting, of patience, was itself a kind of creation. He did not need to force understanding or grasp solutions. He only needed to exist alongside the movement of the world and allow the patterns to reveal themselves. Elliot, sensing Rick's thoughtful mood, nudged his hand gently. "Do you think the world cares if we notice?" Rick smiled softly. "Maybe it doesn't matter," he said. "Maybe what matters is that we do notice, that we pay attention quietly without needing anyone to see." The night arrived, folding the sky into deep blue. Rick returned to his room, settled near the window, and let the lullaby his mother once hummed echo in the quiet. He sketched the subtle rhythms of the evening, shadows dancing, fireflies blinking, stars twinkling in distant patience. Every line in his notebook became a testament to the beauty of small attentions, of gentle acts that, while unseen, held meaning. Sleep arrived slowly, carrying him toward dreams where light bent around invisible corners and clouds whispered secrets of distant lands. In the space between waking and dreaming, Rick sensed a quiet understanding that the universe, vast and patient, existed not only in grand gestures, but in the subtleties of observation, in waiting, in noticing. He closed his eyes fully, letting the quiet hum of life fill him. And somewhere, deep within that gentle patience, he felt a subtle sense of purpose taking root, not in achievements, not in loud revelations, but in the art of waiting, watching, and understanding the world with care. Rick had begun to notice that life often spoke in rhythms too subtle for most to hear. The way leaves trembled in a soft breeze, the slow blink of a firefly, the hum of distant machinery in the quiet streets. Each beat was part of a larger cadence, a hidden pulse beneath the apparent stillness of the world. He spent afternoons walking along winding streets and open fields, notebook in hand, capturing fragments of these rhythms. Elliot padded beside him, occasionally stopping to sniff at a flower or watch a bird. Together they moved with a quiet attentiveness, sensing patterns that others would have passed by without a second thought. One evening, Rick paused by the edge of a stream, listening to the water as it murmured over rocks. It was soft, almost inaudible over the distance, yet rhythmic, soothing. He traced its path with his fingers, imagining tiny machines that could follow its journey, mapping every curve and ripple. And in that simple observation, he felt a new kind of connection, that noticing small things could lead to understanding far greater truths about the world and himself. "Everything has a rhythm," Elliot said softly, sitting beside him and dipping his paw into the cool water. "Even people, even hearts." Rick nodded, watching the water swirl around rocks and roots. "I think you're right," he said, "and if we notice carefully, we can follow the rhythm instead of fighting it." That night, he returned home and spread his sketches across the floor. Clouds, leaves, rivers, the delicate flutter of wings. Each line captured not only the shapes themselves, but the motion, the quiet pulse behind them. Rick realized that this act of noticing, of capturing subtle rhythms, was shaping his understanding of the world. He did not need grand gestures. He did not need accolades. Observation itself was a kind of magic, quiet but profound. Elliot curled beside him as he hummed his mother's lullaby. The notes mingled with the faint hum of the machines in the corners of the room, forming a soft symphony of attention and presence. Rick traced the notes with his fingers, feeling the rhythm in his chest. And for the first time, he understood that small, patient acts, listening, noticing, caring, could ripple outward in ways invisible but enduring. As he drifted into sleep, he imagined the patterns he had traced that day, weaving into larger networks, connecting the river to the stars, the trees to the clouds, and himself to the vastness of existence. In that quiet moment, he realized that life's smallest rhythms were not insignificant. They were threads in the tapestry of the sky universe, waiting for someone patient enough to see them. And Rick, softly smiling beneath the moonlight, let himself fold into the rhythm of all things, trusting that the quiet act of noticing could become a gentle guide for every step he would take. Rick had begun to notice the small ways the world responded to attention. A flower leaned slightly toward the sunlight when he lingered nearby. A bird shifted its flight, pausing as if curious about his presence. Even the shadows seemed to move in softer, gentler arcs when he watched without hurry. He wandered often, notebook in hand, letting the world unfold around him. Elliot padded quietly at his side, alert but calm, sharing in these slow explorations. Rick had learned that presence mattered more than movement, that observation could reveal hidden patterns, and that even silence could carry meaning. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the world in soft amber, Rick noticed a faint glow across the horizon. It was not the sun, not an artificial light, but something subtle and alive, flickering patiently at the edge of his vision. He tilted his head, tracing its rhythm with his eyes, feeling a quiet pull that was neither fear nor urgency. It was the gentle tug of curiosity, urging him to notice more deeply. "The world is full of light we can't always see," Elliot said softly, sitting beside him, eyes reflecting the fading glow. "Even when we think there's only shadow." Rick smiled, feeling a warm certainty bloom within him. "And maybe noticing it is enough," he said, "even if no one else sees." That night, he returned to his room and spread his sketches across the floor. Stars, clouds, rivers, and the faint glowing rhythm he had seen in the distance. Each drawing captured not only what he saw, but the subtle motion, the pulse behind it. The act of sketching became a meditation, a quiet dialogue with the world that required no words, no applause, just patient attention. Elliot curled beside him as he hummed his mother's lullaby. The notes mingled with the soft hum of his machines, forming a gentle symphony of presence. Rick traced the lines of light in his sketches with his fingers, imagining them weaving together, connecting the small pulses of life, creating patterns larger than himself. Sleep arrived slowly, carrying him toward dreams where rivers flowed into skies, clouds folded into stairways, and light moved like a slow, patient tide. In that space between waking and dreaming, he sensed a quiet truth: that the world waited patiently, offering its hidden lights to those who noticed, and that the act of seeing, truly seeing, was a kind of magic in itself. And as the night deepened, Rick let himself fold into that gentle rhythm, trusting that his quiet observations, his sketches, his humming, and his presence could ripple outward in ways unseen but enduring, guiding him toward the future in the softest, most patient way. Rick had begun to notice the way the night sky seemed to respond to attention. Stars weren't merely distant points of light, they were subtle signals, blinking in rhythms that echoed the quiet pulses of life on Earth. He often lay on the hill near his home, notebook resting on his chest, watching their slow, patient dance. Elliot settled beside him, tail curled around his feet. Together they were silent observers, companions in the stillness, sharing in the wonder of things that moved slowly, that revealed themselves only to those patient enough to see. "Do you think they're waiting for us?" Elliot asked softly, looking up. Rick considered the question, eyes tracing constellations that seemed unfamiliar, yet strangely familiar. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe they're just shining. And we notice, and that's enough." The gentle pull of stars inspired him to draw in new ways. He began sketching their patterns, imagining connections between them, imagining tiny machines that could follow the rhythms of light. But it was more than mechanics. It was a meditation, a conversation with the subtle pulses of the universe. He traced lines with careful fingers, letting the sketches become a bridge between observation and imagination, between presence and understanding. Days blended softly into evenings. Rick walked slowly along familiar streets, noting the sway of lamp-post shadows, the quiet flicker of windows, the slow drift of clouds against fading light. Each small observation was a reminder that the world was alive in ways unnoticed, waiting for patient attention, waiting for him to see its rhythms without hurry. One evening, the wind carried a soft, unusual note. Rick tilted his head, listening. It wasn't a sound made by people or machines, but a gentle vibration, almost like the heartbeat of the evening itself. He closed his eyes, letting it settle around him. "Some things," he whispered, "exist just to be noticed." Elliot nudged his hand, a small, companionable gesture that needed no explanation. Rick smiled, feeling the quiet certainty that his attention, his sketches, his curiosity, and his humming of the lullaby all mattered in a subtle, unspoken way. Even when the world seemed vast and unknowable, he was part of its rhythm. That night, lying beneath the gentle pull of stars, Rick let sleep carry him into dreams where light bent across the sky like water, where clouds formed pathways to impossible places, and where even the smallest acts of noticing could ripple outward endlessly. He imagined patterns of light weaving through rivers, forests, streets, and homes, connecting everything in a quiet, infinite dance. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the soft certainty that curiosity, observation, and gentle presence could become a guiding force, shaping not the world loudly, but subtly, patiently, beautifully. Rick had begun noticing the quiet ties that connected everything around him. The wind that bent the grass also shifted the shadows, the birds' songs carried echoes that danced across rooftops, and even the hum of his machines seemed to harmonize with the faint rhythm of the evening. There was a subtle music in the ordinary, waiting for someone to pause and listen. He walked slowly along the fields near his home, notebook in hand, letting his eyes trace the arcs of leaves, the shimmer of dew, the way light pooled around corners. Elliot padded beside him, careful and attentive, as if sensing that even the smallest motions mattered. Rick had started seeing life not as separate fragments, but as threads woven into a quiet, intricate tapestry. "Do you ever feel connected?" Elliot asked softly, his tail flicking in the fading sunlight. Rick paused, watching the way a cloud stretched across the sky. "I think I'm beginning to," he said. "Like everything has a rhythm, and if you pay attention, you can feel how it moves together." Even his sketches began to change. He no longer drew things in isolation. Rivers curved toward clouds, shadows intertwined with stars, leaves traced the hum of the wind. Each line became a bridge between the world he observed and the patterns his imagination could sense. It was less about understanding and more about feeling, less about capturing and more about participating in the rhythm of life itself. That evening, he lay beneath the oak tree as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in amber and violet. The quiet connection between all things, wind, grass, clouds, stars, felt tangible, almost like a soft thread linking him to the universe. He hummed his mother's lullaby, letting it mingle with the distant hum of the world, and felt a warmth spread through him, subtle but undeniable. As night fell, the stars blinked faintly, as if acknowledging his presence. Rick closed his eyes and let the soft pulse of existence seep into him. In his dreams, he wandered along rivers that mirrored the constellations, clouds folded into stairways reaching into endless skies, and every small act of noticing, every hum, every sketch, every patient gaze, became a part of the larger rhythm. He understood deep inside that the quiet ties connecting all things did not require grand gestures or loud proclamations. They existed in the patient act of attention, in the gentle observation of patterns, in the soft awareness that every motion, every breath, every small life played a part in the universe's slow, infinite dance. And as he drifted fully into sleep, he carried the subtle certainty that these ties, invisible yet palpable, would guide him quietly through tomorrow, through small acts of noticing and presence, toward a life filled with wonder, connection, and soft, enduring meaning. Rick had begun to notice the softness that existed between moments. The pause between a bird's wings flapping, the space between one note of a lullaby and the next, the instant when a shadow stretched before the sun dipped fully below the horizon. These were the delicate intervals where life whispered its most subtle truths. He wandered slowly along the familiar streets, notebook in hand, letting his gaze follow the gentle arcs of light and shadow. Elliot padded beside him, tail low, ears attentive, as if he, too, understood the value of silence and the quiet rhythm of observation. Each step, each breath, each flicker of attention became part of a larger meditation on the slow unfolding of existence. "Do you think anyone notices the small things?" Elliot asked softly, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. Rick smiled, tracing the curve of a cloud with his eyes. "Maybe not everyone," he said, "but it doesn't matter. Some things exist to be noticed, quietly, by anyone willing to pause long enough to see them." He had begun to understand that presence itself was a kind of care. Listening to the wind, tracing patterns in clouds, observing the subtle pulse of life. These small acts were forms of attention that rippled outward, even if imperceptibly. They were gestures that mattered quietly, shaping the world without demanding recognition or reward. That night, he lay beneath the oak tree, notebook beside him, and hummed his mother's lullaby. The notes drifted into the darkness, mingling with the faint hum of the evening, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soft pulse of the stars above. Each sound, each motion, each small observation became a thread in the tapestry of his awareness, connecting him gently to the world around him. In his dreams, he wandered through landscapes shaped by his own noticing, rivers that flowed backward into the sky, clouds that formed stairways of light, shadows that danced with gentle precision. Elliot appeared often, a calm presence in the dreamscape, a reminder that companionship and quiet observation could coexist, grounding him even as he wandered far into imagination. Rick realized that the world did not require grand gestures to hold meaning, even the smallest acts. Noticing a leaf's curve, tracing the path of a star, humming a familiar lullaby, carried weight in ways that could be felt deeply if one paused to perceive them. And as he drifted deeper into sleep, he felt the softness between moments stretch around him like a blanket, a gentle assurance that curiosity, presence, and care were already forms of quiet magic. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of dreaming, he sensed the universe waiting patiently, ever patient, as if saying, "Notice, observe, be present, and the rest will unfold gently in its own time." Rick had begun to feel the endless echo of small moments. Every sound, every flicker of light, every gentle sway of leaves seemed to carry traces of time, as if the world remembered every step, every glance, every quiet act of noticing. The hum of his machines, once background noise, now felt like a soft chorus, blending with the whispers of wind and distant birds, creating a rhythm that pulsed gently through the evening. He wandered along familiar streets, notebook in hand, tracing patterns that seemed to fold back into themselves. Elliot followed quietly, their steps in sync, a small companionship that needed no words. Rick had started realizing that life's quiet acts, humming a lullaby, sketching clouds, observing the flow of water, were not just reflections but echoes, looping softly through time and memory. "Do you think everything we notice sticks?" Elliot asked softly, eyes glimmering in the fading light. Rick paused, watching the shadows of leaves ripple across the pavement. "I think it does," he said. "Even if we can't always see it, each small act, each observation, it leaves a trace. It becomes part of something bigger, part of the echo of life itself." That evening, he climbed the hill where he and Elliot often sat. The sky unfolded in gentle layers of orange, pink, and violet, clouds stretching like whispers across the horizon. Rick traced their shapes with his eyes, imagining lines and patterns connecting stars, rivers, trees, and shadows. It felt less like drawing and more like listening, a quiet dialogue with the world's subtle rhythms. At home, he spread his sketches across the floor, each one capturing not only the form but the motion, the pulse of life he had observed. Rivers curved toward clouds, shadows danced with stars. Each drawing became a testament to the quiet, enduring beauty that existed in small acts of attention, patiently waiting to be acknowledged. That night, he hummed his mother's lullaby, letting the notes ripple alongside the gentle hum of his machines. In his dreams, he wandered through landscapes that folded into themselves, rivers flowing into skies, clouds forming stairways to distant stars, and shadows stretching into endless patterns. Elliot was always there, a quiet presence guiding him, reminding him that companionship and attention were intertwined, steadying him even as he explored infinite spaces. Rick realized that the echoes of small, gentle acts, noticing, observing, caring, were not fleeting. They persisted, quietly shaping the world around him. And as he drifted fully into sleep, he felt a soft certainty that every moment, every quiet gesture, every act of noticing would ripple outward, leaving traces of warmth, curiosity, and understanding in ways he might never fully see, yet which were infinitely meaningful. And somewhere across time and space, the universe waited patiently, responding softly, echoing gently, reminding him that the quiet acts of presence and attention were the truest forms of connection. Rick had started to sense the quiet fold of time, how moments layered softly upon one another, how the tiniest observations from years past could ripple into the present. The oak tree, the hills, the familiar streets, all of it seemed to carry the traces of what had been noticed, remembered, and quietly understood. He walked slowly through the evening, notebook in hand, feeling the subtle rhythm of life beneath his feet. Shadows stretched and folded with the light, birds whispered their soft notes, and the distant hum of his machines mingled with the wind. Elliot walked beside him, tail low, attentive, as if even he sensed the gravity and the gentleness of the moment. Rick paused on a familiar hill, watching the sky transform into layers of violet, pink, and amber. He traced clouds with his eyes, imagining them folding into rivers, forests, and the infinite stretches of sky. Everything seemed connected, small acts, moments of attention, quiet humming, soft sketches, each a thread in the vast, patient tapestry of the universe. "Do you think it all matters?" Elliot asked quietly, sitting at his side. Rick smiled softly. "Maybe not in the way we think," he said. "But noticing, being present, caring quietly, those are ways of folding ourselves gently into the world. That, I think, matters." That night he returned to his room, spreading his sketches across the floor. Each one captured more than form. It captured motion, rhythm, life. Shadows danced with stars, Rivers flowed into clouds, tiny glimmers of light threaded through sketches of everyday objects, unseen by others but vibrant to him. He hummed his mother's lullaby, letting the notes mingle with the faint hum of machines and the soft breathing of Elliot. Sleep began to pull him gently, guiding him toward dreams where landscapes folded infinitely. Rivers tracing the paths of stars, clouds forming stairways, shadows stretching and bending in gentle arcs. In these dreams, Rick felt the quiet pull of continuity, that even small, unnoticed acts ripple through time, connecting him to the world in a way that was both vast and intimate. He realized that the universe was not distant or indifferent. It was patient, it was attentive, and it had been waiting for him to notice all along. And as he drifted fully into sleep, he folded into the rhythm of the world, carrying with him the calm certainty that small acts of attention, quiet presence, and gentle care were enough to weave a life of meaning. The stars pulsed softly, the wind whispered in patterns only he could hear, and somewhere, he knew, the universe responded gently to his noticing, and with that, he stretched into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. Ick had begun to notice the subtle glow that presence could bring. It was not light in the ordinary sense, but the quiet radiance that comes from noticing, caring, and simply being attentive. Even the smallest gestures, a hum, a sketch, a soft glance at a fluttering leaf, seemed to carry a luminous quality, a quiet echo that touched the world around him. He wandered through familiar streets as evening settled, notebook in hand, feeling the rhythm of life beneath his feet. Shadows folded gently into light, the wind carried faint whispers across rooftops, and the soft hum of distant machines blended seamlessly with the pulse of the night. Elliot walked beside him, calm and attentive, as if the very act of companionship was a quiet amplification of this glow. Rick paused at a small stream, watching its water ripple over stones. Each movement seemed deliberate, precise, yet effortless. He traced the curves with his finger, imagining the flow as a language of subtle signals, patterns that existed quietly for anyone patient enough to notice. "Do you think presence can be felt?" Elliot asked, sitting at his side. Rick smiled softly. "I think it already is," he said. "Even if no one acknowledges it, leaves a mark. It folds into the world, into time, like light slipping quietly through a window." That night, back in his room, he spread sketches across the floor. Rivers folded into clouds, shadows danced with stars, and even the hum of machines seemed to pulse with rhythm. The sketches were no longer just observations. They were a meditation, a gentle documentation of connection, a testament to the quiet glow that comes from paying attention. He hummed his mother's lullaby, letting it drift softly across the room. Elliot curled at his side, and together they became part of the quiet symphony of observation and presence. Sleep arrived gently, carrying Rick into dreams where light traced invisible pathways, clouds formed gentle stairways into infinite skies, and shadows intertwined with stars in soft, deliberate arcs. In this dreamscape, Rick realized that the subtle glow of presence was its own kind of magic. Quiet, patient, enduring. Even the smallest attention, the softest hum, the gentlest sketch could ripple outward, unseen but profoundly felt. And in that understanding, he sensed the soft rhythm of his life extending outward into the world, connecting him to time, space, and all the small wonders that had quietly shaped him. And as sleep deepened, he let himself fold fully into the rhythm of noticing, carrying with him the quiet certainty that presence, patient, attentive, gentle, was enough to illuminate not only the world, but his own path within it, and somewhere he's still out there, napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. Rick had begun to feel the gentle whisper of tomorrow in every moment. Not urgency, not worry, but a soft, persistent nudge carried by the wind, the sway of leaves, the faint hum of machines. It was as if time itself had folded around him, allowing him to glimpse continuity without needing to grasp it. He walked along familiar paths, notebook in hand, letting his gaze follow the slow arcs of clouds and the faint glimmer of distant lights. Elliot padded beside him, ears alert, tail brushing the ground softly. Together they moved through the evening like gentle observers of a world that was patient, waiting, and infinitely expansive. "Do you think tomorrow listens?" Elliot asked, settling beside him. Rick tilted his head toward the horizon, where the sky softened into shades of violet and amber. "I think it does," he said. "Not in words, not in noise, but in quiet ways. It nudges us, hints at paths, leaves tiny signs if we notice." That night, he returned to his room and spread sketches across the floor. Shadows curled gently into light, rivers bent toward clouds, stars seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. His sketches were more than drawings now. They were meditations, small maps of attention, quiet testaments to noticing the invisible threads that linked moments, people, and the world. He hummed his mother's lullaby, letting it float softly through the room. Elliot curled beside him, a calm presence anchoring him, and together they became part of a quiet symphony, hums, sketches, breaths, and small gestures folding into the vast rhythm of existence. Sleep drew him into dreams where patterns of light traced themselves across rivers and forests, clouds folded into stairways that led to the stars, and shadows moved in deliberate arcs, gentle and purposeful. Rick understood in that dream space that the whisper of tomorrow was not a call to action, but an invitation to presence, to notice, to care, to fold patiently into the quiet flow of life. He realized that even the smallest attention, a sketch, a hum, a soft glance at the world, was enough to ripple outward, carrying subtle warmth, curiosity, and understanding into time itself. Each act, however quiet, added to the tapestry of life, forming connections beyond what eyes could see or words could capture. And as sleep deepened, Rick allowed himself to fold into the whisper of tomorrow, trusting the slow, gentle unfolding of life, presence, and attention to guide him. In that soft understanding he felt calm certainty that quiet acts, patient noticing, and gentle care were enough to illuminate his path and leave traces in the world that would endure in subtle ways. And somewhere he's still out there, napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. Rick had begun to notice the breath between stars. Not a rush of cosmic events, but the subtle pauses, the quiet spaces where the universe seemed to exhale. He often lay on the hill, notebook resting on his chest, eyes tracing constellations as they pulsed with imperceptible rhythm. Each blink, each flicker, each gentle glow felt like a soft reminder that patience and attention carried their own quiet magic. Elliot curled beside him, tail brushing against his hand. Together they were witnesses, companions in the stillness, sharing the gentle rhythm that existed between moments. Rick had started understanding that the spaces, the intervals, the pauses, were where subtle truths revealed themselves, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. "Do you think the universe waits?" Elliot asked softly, eyes reflecting the dim starlight. Rick smiled, tracing a line between two distant stars. "I think it does," he said. "It waits in silence, giving space for noticing, for presence, for quiet care. And in that waiting, it holds everything together." That evening, he spread his sketches across the floor. Rivers curved toward clouds. Shadows stretched alongside stars. Light threaded gently through familiar streets. His sketches were no longer mere observations, they were meditations, gentle conversations with the rhythm of the world. Every line captured not just form, but motion, patience, and quiet continuity. He hummed his mother's lullaby softly, letting it mingle with the hum of his machines, the rustle of leaves, and the faint whisper of night. Elliot slept beside him, grounding the quiet music of attention and presence. Sleep drew Rick into dreams where rivers folded into skies, clouds became stairways into endless horizons, and stars pulsed in rhythm with small acts of noticing. In this dream space, he realized that life's pauses, the breath between moments, the quiet spaces, carried as much significance as the moments themselves. Even small acts of presence, gentle sketches, and soft humming rippled outward, folding into time, shaping the world in imperceptible but enduring ways. And as he drifted deeper into sleep, Rick folded himself into the rhythm of the universe's breath, trusting the quiet spaces to carry him forward, to guide him through time, and to remind him gently that noticing, caring, and being present were more than enough to leave a lasting trace in the tapestry of life. And somewhere, he's still out there, napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. Rick had begun to sense the gentle return of everything he had noticed. The hills, the oak tree, the familiar streets, even the quiet hum of his machines, all seemed to fold back into him, carrying echoes of attention, care, and presence from days and years past. It was not memory alone, but a weaving of experience and awareness, subtle and luminous, like light reflected softly on water. He wandered slowly through the evening, notebook in hand, letting his gaze trace the gentle arcs of shadows and fading sunlight. Elliot padded quietly beside him, tail low, ears alert, a steady presence in the unfolding rhythm. Rick had begun to understand that life's quiet gestures, humming a lullaby, sketching a cloud, observing a ripple in a stream, returned to him in ways that were gentle, cumulative, and deeply meaningful. "Do you think it all comes back?" Elliot asked softly, settling beside him. Rick smiled, eyes following the delicate flutter of leaves. "Yes," he said. "Not in the way we expect, but in echoes, in rhythms, in quiet folds. Every moment we notice, every small act of attention, comes back as understanding, warmth, and presence." That night, he spread his sketches across the floor, rivers intertwined with clouds, shadows curved with stars, tiny pulses of light threaded through familiar objects, unseen by others, but vivid to him. Each line was a gentle reminder that quiet observation and patient attention were acts of creation, weaving a tapestry that was both personal and universal. He hummed his mother's lullaby softly, letting it blend with the hum of the machines, the rustle of leaves outside, and Elliot's calm breathing. Sleep arrived gently, carrying him into dreams where patterns of light traced invisible stairways, clouds folded softly into rivers, and shadows danced alongside stars. Each dream was a reflection of the echoes he had gathered, the return of noticing, presence, and care he had offered to the world. In that dream space, Rick understood that the world was patient, that life returned gently, and that small acts, hums, sketches, quiet observation, left ripples that persisted, folding through time in subtle, enduring ways. The return was not loud, not dramatic, but quietly magnificent like the gentle exhale of the universe itself. And as he drifted deeper into sleep, he folded fully into the gentle return of everything he had noticed, trusting the quiet rhythm of life, presence, and care to carry him forward, and feeling soft certainty that every small attention, every gentle act was enough. And somewhere, he's still out there, napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. Rick lay beneath the hill's familiar oak tree, night folding around him like a soft blanket. Stars blinked gently above, pulsing in rhythms he had long since learned to notice. The hum of distant machines, the faint rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind across the grass. Each sound was a subtle reminder that he was part of something larger, quietly attentive and patiently enduring. Elliot curled beside him, a steady warmth in the dark. Together they had walked through countless days, noticed countless small things, and traced patterns invisible to all but the most patient eyes. Rick had begun to understand that life's beauty was not in grand gestures or loud proclamations, but in the quiet acts of noticing, the gentle folds of attention, and the soft patience that allowed time to reveal its patterns. He hummed his mother's lullaby, letting the notes mingle with the night, weaving through shadows, stars, and soft light. His sketches lay around him, rivers folding into clouds, shadows dancing with stars, the smallest glimmers of attention captured on paper. These sketches were no longer mere drawings, they were meditations, quiet testaments to presence, care, and the enduring rhythm of life. "Do you think it's enough?" Elliot whispered, tail brushing against him. Rick smiled softly, tracing the outline of a star with his finger. "It's more than enough," he said. "Not because it changes everything loudly, but because it folds gently into the world, quietly shaping it. Every moment we notice, every soft act of attention becomes part of the rhythm, and that is everything." Sleep began to draw him into its gentle embrace. In his dreams, rivers flowed upward into skies, clouds formed stairways to infinite horizons, and stars pulsed in soft arcs, mirroring the quiet heartbeat of the universe. Elliot was always there, a calm anchor in the dreamscape, reminding him that companionship, presence, and gentle attention were inseparable. Rick realized, finally, that life's quiet acts, humming a lullaby, sketching patterns, observing the subtle rhythms of light, shadow, and wind, were not fleeting. They persisted, rippling outward, folding back, returning softly to him and others, forming an invisible network of care and presence that extended endlessly. And as the night deepened, he allowed himself to exhale fully, folding into the rhythm of everything he had noticed, everything he had loved, everything he had quietly tended. The world pulsed gently around him, the stars blinked softly, and for the first time in a long while, he felt complete. And with that, he stretched into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.